Hello dear students. In this lecture, we will have deliberations on the position of women in Greek civilization with following objectives. The first objective is to assess women's general condition in ancient Greece, to understand women's varied roles in ancient Greek society, and women's public role will be highlighted. Efforts will be made to understand how far women folk remained subordinate to their male counterparts. In the introduction, it is impossible to understand the nature of Greek civilization without taking into account the women who made up 50% of the Greek population and their position and function in Greek society and politics. As in contemporary societies, a large portion of the poor and working population consisted of women. They performed labor in farms and homes. They worked in fields and houses. In Greek society, they also formed a big part of the slave population. The land-owning classes, who were often the ruling elite, greatly benefited in terms of both income and leisure from the surplus that was extracted from the labor of women. Women also worked as slaves in the home and in the textile and craft manufacturing units. Women were subjected to the same treatment as male prisoners of war who were abducted and turned into slaves. This is true for all the Greek city-states. It is important to emphasize the subordination of women in light of attempts to portray ancient societies as somehow golden, when in fact women shared in the greatness of these communities, which was overstated in the first place. Women were worshipped as goddesses, and there were well-known smart women in the ruling classes whose names can be found in written sources. In the past, many people took part in public religious ceremonies, but there was a big difference, those in power and those who worked, whether they were slaves or not. These differences are clear when you look at how people spend their free time, how comfortable and happy they are, and how much they learn. There were also courtesans who were very smart and accomplished. Another facet of Greek civilization was the institution of prostitution. Women did not have the same rights as other people. In fact, they were not considered citizens and could not even take part in the lower level meetings, let alone higher ones. Women were not allowed to inherit property or own their property. With the introduction of the notion of private property, families had already begun to assume a patriarchal pattern, with fathers or husbands in authority. The functions of women in Greece. Women in ancient Greece were primarily responsible for three tasks: childbearing, fabric weaving, and household management. They had a limited access to education because their husbands and siblings participated in political and social activities. However, despite societal inequity and prohibition, women had played an essential part in defining Greece's cultural, political, and economic landscape. Large-scale slavery in the city-state made homes bigger and gave women, especially wealthy women, more responsibilities. Wives were given responsibility for running the home because they worked alongside their husband to maintain the family when the latter was away performing, participating in politics, or hanging out with their male friends. They were expected to take care of the children, make sure food was kept afresh and ready to eat, keep track of the family's finance, weave clothes to make clothes, and supervise the work of the household slaves and care for them when they were sick. So, household relied on women whose work made it possible for the family to be financially independent and for men to participate in the polis, public life. Poor women sometimes worked as small-scale traders in the public market, which is generally also known by the name of agora, which was located in the middle of each settlement. Sparta was the only place where women were free to train in athletics along with men. Women's main role in the city-state's public life was to participate in funerals, state festivals, and religious ceremonies. Some festivals were only for women, like the cult of the goddess Dimitri, whom the Greeks thought had taught them how to farm, which was an important skill. As priestess, women also did public work in official cults. For example, by the 5th century BCE, women were priestesses in more than 40 official cults in Athens. Women who held these jobs often had a lot of prestige and practical benefits, like getting paid by the government and more freedom to move around in public. After engaging in a marriage contract with a man, women were their husband's legal responsibility, just as they had been their father's responsibility before marriage. For the marriage to be valid, the bride had to move into her husband's house. The woman brought with her a dowry of property that may be either in land or at times money, and personal belongings that became part of the new family's assets and could be passed on to her children. The law lays her husband had to keep the dowry and give it back if they divorced. In ancient Greece, it was common for a husband, wife, and children to live together without other family members in the same house. This was not the case in Sparta, but at different times in their lives, a married couple might have had other family members living with them. Citizen men could have sexual relations with slaves, foreign concubines, female prostitutes, or willing young citizen boys without getting in trouble. Citizen women did not have this kind of sexual freedom. More than anything else, the fact that Greek women's legal rights and citizenship conditions were put under the care of men was due to a desire to control marriage and childbirth and to keep the family property. The need to control human reproduction and, by extension, the distribution of property, a concern that had taken on particular urgency under the depressed economic conditions of the Dark Age, was the source of Greek men's paternalistic attitude towards women. Now we will discuss submissive status of women. A substantial proportion of slaves were women. However, it is necessary to highlight the particular aspects of a subordination. In addition to their duties as slaves in certain workshops and as domestic servants, it may be stated that women were limited to the home. Thus, the reality was complex. A vast portion contributed to the creation of surplus wealth and production. At the same time, a small elite minority participated in religious life and community, or at least comprised the minority of the citizen community. Women were depicted as participants in rituals and religious festivals, but their role in these events did not elevate their status. Similarly, some rites are prescribed and conducted by children who are graded according to their position and subordinate functions as minors. Obviously, citizens' wives also shared the citizens' status, as their offspring would become citizens and their daughters would marry citizens. Women, especially those of higher class, were not permitted to testify or attend court under the law. Men on both sides of their disputes participated in judicial proceedings, but only poor and enslaved women were present. It was usually believed that women could not be depended upon. Thus, their testimony was also only considered credible if it was extracted by torture. Cases involving children were in reality battle between their guardians. Only after attaining maturity were minors eligible to testify, represent themselves, serve in the military, and serve as jurors after the age of 30, except for the early frescoes which depict them engaging in athletics throughout the early stages. Ancient art and literature primarily depict women engaged in domestic tasks. In the economy, women only participated in sectors that were not deemed essential. They did not attend markets where even minor businesses occurred, that is, selling and purchasing goods. And young boys were only permitted to attend after midday when the market was crowded. This does not apply to poor women who were active buyers and sellers of little goods. Prostitution was a field where women dominated, but social distinctions separated the public sphere of prostitution from the realm of prostitution among privileged classes and families. Women lived under the supervision of male family members, fathers, brothers, husbands, without independent individual rights, especially in property and inheritance affairs. Throughout historical eras, the division of labor between male and female household members was well delineated. Numerous affluent women were educated, but their written or oral poetry is largely unknown. Sappho is a well-known woman for her lyrical poetry, written to be sung while accompanied by music. The stitching and weaving of woolen goods, etc., were done by privileged women for use rather than profit. But the abilities of poorer women were tied to their means of subsistence. Now we will look in public activities of women. Aside from married women, women who chose to serve the Greek goddesses were also in charge of many other things, such as waving the peplos or robes worn at the Panthenia festival. Even though some of the Greek women were wrong about who they were, most of them were right about what girls should do when they hit puberty. Even though girls and women were not allowed to take part in public life in the Greek polis, they still contribute to social, religious, and political life. A number of statues such as Nicandry of Naxos, Aphrodite of Athens, and Telestodike of Paros show how religious and ritualistic women were. These life-size or even larger figures were depicted as goddesses. On the columns, there were also statues, various cultural, mythical, and religious foundations for devotion to women exist. For example, the statue of Nicandry of Naxos on the island of Delos is a well-known shrine of Artemis. It is a larger than life-size figure. Since Naxos is close to the Ionian island, Ionian women went to the festival in Delos with their husbands. People think that Nicandry went to Delos with her husband and children to see the statue get dedicated. Delon also comes to the conclusion that this is a very large and public dedication made in the name of, if not by a woman, and apparently a newly married one. By writing this dedication, Nicandry makes it clear that she is religious and sees it as a way to show her position and how she sees herself. Other statues of women are mostly life-size to show that they were not goddesses. Young girls were singing religious songs in choruses when they were not worshipping or making vows. Women of all ages also took part in religious celebrations like the Panathenea, which was held to honor Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. Men and women both went to this festival, but there were also festivals only for women, such as the Halau, the Thesmopharin, and the Sikeria. All of these festivals showed how important women were to the growth of new plants and to the survival of the Greek community as a whole. Various religious rituals were prescribed for the girls who wanted to get married. For example, girls younger than 14 were chosen to serve goddesses like Artemis. The men used the girls as tools that could be tamed after they got married. At this point, a woman's self-perception in ancient Greece was controlled by how she behaved at home, by repeated religious and social virtues, and by the traditions and rituals she took part in, which helped her learn and be valued in the community. In order to define the different parts of women's work and activities as well as their roles and rituals, it's important to look at gender identity and the effects of civic participation In Greece, women were limited by patriarchal culture, but they were still able to shape their own path of influence in a society dominated by men. There were three cultural areas where women were affected by rituals, which showed who they were and what they needed. The focus is on how ritual figures are used in female poetry, the idea of mannerism, and how women were shown in Attic vases. Women's cultural production shape a set of experiences that speak to a very female way of seeing the world. Goff says that this is because the gender division of labor that was part of Greek culture was supported not only by differences in space but also by ideas that women were less capable. Men's obvious inequality and power led to the rise of subcultural and outcast groups where women tried to get noticed. Classical Greek women also had trouble getting education because they were seen as less important. During this time, Sparta was the only city state where girls could go to school and receive education. The girls went to school in the city to learn about Greek myths, philosophy, and poetry. Women also took part in a variety of artistic activities which made them good singers and dancers. Sparta, unlike Athens, was known for bringing together talented poetesses and female writers who were also well versed in poetry and philosophy. So, while Spartan men were learning how to be soldiers, women who were less interested in war got a good education. Greek philosophers also use other facts about women in Sparta that are interesting. In particular, women also took part in sports like race, wrestling, and even throwing the discus. Because of this, it is not surprising that Greek women are often pictured as having very beautiful skin, slim bodies, and golden hair. At the end of the 5th century BCE, there was a certain way to do these physical preparations. Girls also enjoyed gymnasium exercises since they permitted them to engage in women's ceremonies. In truth, the competition among adolescent girls in Sparta was tied to the religious worship of Dionysus, which was a component of the initiation ceremony of girls who were about to become women. In Lysistrata, one can observe the example of women's physical health contributing to her beauty. The competition therefore symbolizes the possession of the virtue of a youthful, free, and marriage-ready woman. The story also indicates that all of a woman's activities should contribute to her maturation and readiness for marriage and motherhood. Now, we will look at man's attitude and occupation. The majority of Greek philosophers and great thinkers recognize women's concrete impact on social, cultural, and political life. In spite of this, the majority of historical events in Greek history revolve around men as vice rulers and conquerors. In fact, women provided men with tremendous support and were the mothers of their children until the police was instituted. Women also acted as a way of communication between males from different cultures. In particular, women defined the distinctions between public and private activities in more detail. Although women passively participated in political and cultural life, they were excluded from the operations of democracy and the recognized realm of creative production. Now, citizenship, marriage, and inheritance. Pericles enacted a law in 451 BCE that recognized a child as an Athenian citizen only if both parents were citizens. For the decree to make sense, it appears that a female citizen was classified as a daughter of a male citizen. Indeed, a male adult citizen enjoyed all political and legal privileges that a female adult citizen, as previously described, did not enjoy. Male citizens were referred to as politis and female citizens as polities. Before the order of Pericles, only the father had to be a citizen. After the mid-5th century, neither male nor female Athenians were allowed to marry a foreigner. A non-citizen convicted of this offense was sold as a slave, while an Athenian married to a non-citizen was fined 1,000 drachmas. As Pericles did with Aspasia, It was permissible to live with a strange woman as a mistress. So says Demosthenes jokingly, courtesan whom we keep for a pleasure, mistress for the day-to-day care of our persons, but spouses to bear us legitimate offsprings and to be faithful housekeepers. There were two types of mistresses, those raised to produce treason offsprings and those who were not. The Edict of Pericles required the former to be treasonous themselves, except in the case of Aspasia, whose children were granted citizenship by a separate decree. The latter were typically slaves, as were their descendants. According to Diogenes Laertius, the legislation of 406 allowed a married man to have legitimate children with any woman other than his wife. As a result of population during the Peloponnesian War, the Pericles decree of citizenship was widely disregarded until the end of the war, when it was reinstated, and remained in effect until the collapse of Athenian democracy. Most weddings are arranged by fathers. Sons occasionally influenced their marriage, although daughters never did. A woman was not permitted to marry her mother's direct ancestors, descendants, brother, or half-brother. She can marry her half-brother if they have the same father, uncle, or cousin. There was no written documentation or marriage registration. A marriage promise between a man and the bride's father, known as anji, was used in court as evidence of a valid marriage. In order to register a child in the Praetaria clan, that is a clan registry, the father had to swear that the child was born through the energy of a commoner woman. When the head of the family died, his fortune was divided equally among his surviving sons. If he had no son but a daughter, that is being called in Greek as epikloros, she was married to the deceased father's closest male cousin. The husband would oversee the property until the birth of a son. Eventually, the son would inherit the inheritance. When a man had neither son nor a daughter, he usually adopted a boy. It was assumed that widows would live with their sons. Now we will look at prostitution in Athens. Although prostitutes could be male or female, most of their clients were men. Men were permitted to engage in sexual activities before or alongside marriage, while the virginity of the free women was strictly maintained in ancient Greek culture. Not only were women forbidden to patronize prostitutes, which is not surprising, but free-born women were usually unapproachable or at least dangerous to men if persecuted outside of marriage. Consequently, numerous authors suggested that men should frequent prostitutes rather than engage in the dangerous hunt for free women whose husband or relatives can execute any man caught red-handed on the spot. Athenian authors viewed prostitution as evil when men squandered their wealth on expensive hetaria. Athens was home to a wide variety of prostitution conditions and arrangements. At one end of the spectrum, prostitutes worked in brothels or street walkers serving their customers in semi-public areas. At the other end of the spectrum was the hetaria, the feminine form of the Greek word for comrade or companion. Rich men can hire hetaria for anything from a single evening for a party or symposium to several months. Instead of renting, some wealthy men brought slaves as mistresses for a relationship that can last for years. Therefore, slave prostitution could be temporary or permanent. The longer term and thus more expensive contracts were probably the domain of wealthier clients and led to a less desolate existence for the slave on average. A bewildering collection of vase paintings reveal an unexpected facets of Athenian prostitution. These vases depict men approaching women waving with gifts or bundles of money. These vases represent the moment when slaves switched from one form of labor to another, a movement that reportedly appealed to buyers of painted vases. Building Zad in the Sarmacis was once a brothel occupied by foreign female slaves. In fact, room waiters were discovered in it. The main evidence that building Z was a brothel was the unusual layout of the floors and numerous small rooms. Sherds of fine drinking bowls were discovered in the main rooms of the building, suggesting that the owners may have attempted to create a party environment for their customers. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.